I guess we should get going. So interestingly, Josh and I have been working on Ceph together for 9 years now. And this is the first time we give a talk together. So yeah. It's taken some time. It's nice to be back at the summit. My first summit was back when D was shipping and E was being planned, Essex. And it was a time of transition for me as I was going from being a lizard to a warthog, if you understand what that means in Linux distribution terms. And now it's another time of transition for us with Ceph going from Red Hat to IBM. So we wanted to take the opportunity to give a picture of what's happening going forward, trying to answer some questions, tell you what we know and what we don't know. And, well, that's the agenda for today. So, as most of you should know by now, in January, the Ceph team moved from Red Hat to IBM, all 300 of us. There is, the products that we used to make for Red Hat are still there. Technically, as a business person, you can think of them as Red Hat OEM Ceph from IBM. But now it's all being done at IBM. And that is an interesting opportunity for us because Red Hat saw storage as a platform attached business. So sell storage to OpenStack customers, sell storage to OpenShift customers. But it was pretty clear that Red Hat wasn't going to go into the storage market as a standalone storage player. And Ceph has grown to the point where that was needed. We have dominance of the OpenStack market. We've had it for as long as the surveys of the OpenStack Foundation have been coming out. And it is in a very good place in terms of Kubernetes storage. So what next? We run out of platforms. IBM is obviously a big storage vendor. It's one of the top 3. So it's obviously the place for us to continue the journey. But obviously, change brings confusion. So there is always explaining to be done. And so how do we go from Essex to now I'm standing here with an IBM badge, wearing a Monkey Island t-shirt, as IBM junior executives tend to do. How does the picture look like? So this is the way we explain to IBM higher-ups what is going on in making Ceph. So to you, it must be absolutely clear. The point that we have is that we have obviously the upstream distribution, and then we have all sorts of motions that we have to go through to make a product, which really shouldn't matter to you, except in a way they do. Essentially, it's my job to make sure, among other things, that what's happening in the corporate world is not messing up our community, and I think that so far, so good. But the connections between the upstream releases and the downstream releases can be confusing, especially now that the vendor is changing. So here is the FAQ for people that are Ceph customers of Red Hat and they're going to IBM. So the first question is, who's doing this? Well, actually, I'm doing this out of order. Here is the FAQ. We are doing one code base downstream for all the products that we're going to base on Ceph. And I'm the platform director. Basically, my responsibility is making sure that the platform is consistent and satisfies all of our businesses. So people that ask the question, is this feature in IBM Ceph, is this feature in Red Hat Ceph? The answer is everything is exactly the same. There may be a slight time difference, like they could be a few weeks out of sync, but they are meant to be the same. The difference is commercial. So somebody that's producing Ceph for Kubernetes is going to choose to support certain components of the platform. Somebody that's doing bare metal Ceph for 10 petabytes of storage on bare metal is going to choose other things. So the policy is commercial. Technically, the code base that we're shipping is the same on both sides. The team that's doing all of this is the same. As I was saying, we're OEMing this back to Red Hat, so we at IBM are doing exactly what we were doing before on the Red Hat side. The same people are doing the same stuff. There are some exceptions. Obviously, support teams needed to be duplicated. Consulting is split. But largely, engineering-wise, it's the same thing. The life cycle is still 3 years with the potential of buying an extended support. None of that has changed, and the IBM product is largely structured along the lines of what is in the Red Hat product. And this is an upstream event, so I don't want to bother you. But if you're a customer, nothing has changed there, broadly speaking. The part that's interesting is now there is a way to upgrade from Red Hat storage to IBM Ceph, or we call them Red Ceph and Blue Ceph for brief. There is what we call a cross-grade, which is a particular migration path where you treat this as an upgrade. And the other thing that's exciting as a general feature for both of these is that you can do N+2. So customers that are running Ceph Storage 5 can go all the way to Ceph Storage 7, which means Quincy to REEF in community terms. And that solves an interesting scenario for people that are in production and they don't like to upgrade too much. While we productize every single release as we did before, so that people that want the upgrade because they want a new feature can get it every year. The slide that I skipped is that Ceph at IBM is the core of a number of different initiatives, and that is why it's important that there is a single Ceph, so that we, with the limited size of a team that we have, there is only 300 of us, don't get pulled into too many directions, right? So there is what used to be the Red Hat business, which is half of it is OpenStack Ceph. The other half is building petabyte scale object storage clusters for S3 compatibility in your data center. Then there is Kubernetes Ceph, which is what goes by the brand of OpenShift Data Foundation, which is also bundled into an IBM product that's called IBM Fusion. IBM Storage Ceph is the new Ceph on the IBM side. This has the same ambitions about object as the Red Hat product, but it also wants to target file and NVMe and block. And IBM Cloud can use Ceph as a background technology that they don't need to advertise, but as a foundational technology. And eventually we'll make appliances. So all of these are the same Ceph. That's the important point that I'm trying to make. You don't have to go investigate what is in this versus what is in that. It's the same version. You have the same exact features. Don't go chasing around technical details that don't matter. Now, usually, in this session, the way we used to do it was that I would do the upstream product roadmap for 18 months, and Sage would do I would do the downstream for 18 months, and Sage would do the upstream for the next cycle. Unfortunately, we're late. We're late downstream, and we're late upstream, as REEF hasn't shipped yet. So the full picture for 18 months is not there yet. But we have been planning what 7, which is REEF in enterprise support terms, will look like. And I can give you an idea of what is going to be in our REEF-based product. We don't need to go over all of this. It would be ridiculous. But the part that is interesting...
I don't have an answer for that.
Well, thank you, sir. The part that is interesting is what has changed in terms of focus. We are going to add NFS, both for CephFS and for RGW, in tech preview status, so in unsupported status, but essentially code complete, in the 6.1 release, both on the IBM side and on the Red Hat side. On the Red Hat side, this is marked as limited availability because Red Hat is not, product decisions, as I was saying, is not going after the NFS market in general. They're interested in NFS for some Kubernetes use cases and for OpenStack Manila support. So there, it's fully supported. IBM instead is very much interested in general purpose NFS, and so that's where it's going. Tech preview basically in a few weeks from now, and then it's going to be fully supported, we aim for the end of the year. That is one of the big items. The other big item is that we're focusing on productizing the NVMe over Fabrics, or proper NVMe over TCP gateway that IBM research has been developing for a year and a half now, that you have probably spotted in GitHub if you track this kind of thing. This is going to be in tech preview by the end of the year, and we aim to support it next year. That is essentially a path to VMware support, if you want to think about what would I use this for. That is what it's meant for. There are lots of other things that are interesting, like there is a Crimson Tech Preview, but obviously you can get Crimson Tech Preview upstream as well, and it may make more sense. On the objects front, the big item is a worm certification, so that we can do that kind of workload with full certification in typically financial companies. Now, this is sort of a history slide, since I always have history slides in this talk. This is mostly another internal IBM slide. That is not what's relevant to you. What is relevant to you is the 3 to 5 exabyte deployed. I wanted to spotlight the estimates. So there is now in the community telemetry more than 1 exabyte of Ceph that pings the community servers. We have more than 1 exabyte of enterprise-supported customers that are not in the same set. So that's 2 exabytes right there. And if you ask me to prove it, I could give you the names of enough customers, of enough Ceph users that are not necessarily customers to get to 3.5 petabytes easily, 3.5 exabytes easily. So that's the lower bound estimate for where the Ceph community is today. That's why we say that it's between 3.5 and 5.5 exabytes is where Ceph's reach today. So we're barely at the beginning. And I'm going to hand it over to Josh to discuss what's happening with SQUID.
All right, thank you, Federico. So I'll talk a bit about SQUID and a bit about upcoming REEF release, which we just released the RC for REEF this week. We're trying to get much more community involved in testing out the new releases before they get out there for the first time. So please, if you have a staging cluster or testing cluster, try it out. Tell us what's going on. I've had some good feedback about performance so far, but we're always interested in hearing more. So some general updates about the project. We've got a new governance model. Since the founder of the project, Sage Weil, stepped back a couple years ago, we have elected committee, Ceph Executive Council, which currently consists of myself, Dan van der Steur over there, and Neha Osha, who couldn't make it this time, who are responsible for kind of coordinating the project, making sure everything is getting done. And everything technical is still driven by the existing Ceph leadership team, which consists of engineers responsible for the various components of Ceph, like RGW, RBD, RADOS, these things. Some of the major focus areas we have recently have been around improving our stability and quality, and we're trying to, like I said, improve the release processes, having more RCs published, more well-tested, and well-tested at scale before getting out there into wide use, and much more scale and performance hardening as well. So with the REEF release, we're going to have probably the most hours of anything we've ever done, with really finely detailed testing on recovery and quality of service, which makes it's going to make things much more efficient and much more durable overall and a better experience for users. And as Federico mentioned, our telemetry is now showing that we have more than 1 exabyte reporting publicly to the upstream and Ceph telemetry servers. We're trying to expand the data gathered there a little bit, and it's all opt-in, so this is all off by default. So these are users who have explicitly enabled reporting data to us so that we can tell what people are using Ceph for, how they're using it, what kind of how they're deploying their clusters, and maybe getting some insights into which features we should be looking at. And it also collects information like crash reports, so we can easily tell if there's an issue with a release that's very widespread or we should be looking at. And these you can also see all this information publicly at the telemetrypublic.ceph.com website. So as I mentioned, we're at the RC phase for REEF. This was a little bit delayed this year. Normally we're releasing every release in March of the year, but we had some infrastructure issues. So we'll be releasing REEF likely around July this time, and then get back onto our usual schedule with SQUID being March in 2024. And we're, once REEF is out there, upstream we support these releases, 2 releases back for a few months after the stable release is out there. So once REEF is out, a few months later, we'll deprecate Pacific and do the final point release for it, and continue supporting Quincy and REEF for the next year. So let's get into more detail about what's going on, what's new in REEF and SQUID. We already talked a bit about more performance and scale testing we're doing. In RADOS, one of the big things is quality of service. So this was first came out in Quincy. It's undergone a lot of hardening and testing, such that you can choose how your background I/O in your cluster relates to what your users are doing with kind of 3 main profiles. If you want to have a balanced profile, that's the default. If you want to focus on recovering much more quickly, maybe after some major disaster, you can choose that. Or you can have just more client-focused workloads and let background operations like recovery and data scrubbing operate at a lower rate without affecting users too much. It kind of measures the performance of your devices automatically when the OSDs start up. So it tries to automatically determine how much I/O bandwidth they have and how much it can be used for different operations in the cluster. There's ongoing work to make this in SQUID available on a client versus client basis. So right now it's only for choosing how to prioritize background operations versus client workloads. In SQUID and future releases, we're looking at prioritizing different clients differentially. So you might have one set of clients that is more latency focused and wants some guaranteed number of IOPS going on. You might have another set of clients that's more throughput focused and has different requirements there. So that's more future work there. In general, there's a lot of work in BlueStore around increasing performance. In REEF, there's a there's less wasted space, there's less write application due to the minimum allocation size going down to 4 kilobytes for both hard disks and SSDs now. There's also much more efficient snapshotting logic in REEF, which means that if you're taking lots and lots of snapshots, it's going to have much less overhead in BlueStore, which is a big deal if you're wanting to use like differential backups with very frequent backups, or if you're doing kind of RBD mirroring snapshot-oriented mode. So one of the big areas of new development in Ceph is Crimson. This is a rewrite of the OSD data path to focus on very fast new devices and being much more efficient in CPU usage than the existing architecture. Currently, it's in a very early stage still, where it's available for testing, and it can run many RBD and RGW workloads, but it's not ready for production use at all yet. So we encourage people to try it out, report bugs, but don't put anything you care about on it yet. And the other thing to note there is that we haven't optimized it at all yet, so performance is better, but it's not anywhere near what it's going to be once it's actually optimized. The second part of that project is a new backend store. Instead of BlueStore, which is you can use with Crimson today, there's a new backend SEASTORE, which is entirely new. Doesn't use RocksDB. It uses its own custom B-tree and log-structured format, which is much more efficient for really fast flash devices, and works very well for newer devices that support zone namespaces, as well as potentially in the future even slow devices like SMR hard disks. There's a lot of work to just stabilize things here and further optimizations as we start actually focusing on performance in Crimson. Right now, all the architectural pieces are in place, so a lot of things can be further customized, but we haven't really dove deep into the performance aspect of things yet. In terms of telemetry, we're trying to, as I mentioned, collect a bit more data. We also have information being collected around drive failures. A few years back, there was a manager module contributed by a startup that was doing kind of AI on drive failure detection, trying to predict when a drive will fail before it actually does. And we're trying to gather a bit more data from that for that purpose with the telemetry project as well. With REEF and further with SQUID, there's more optional collection of performance metrics as well, so we can start getting an idea of what kinds of workloads people are seeing and running, and maybe what kinds of configurations they may have that may be impacting those. In terms of the Ceph dashboard, we're always trying to make things much more easy to use, and this is the kind of web GUI for operating a Ceph cluster. There's a new landing page now. There's some more support for some more complex RGW and RBD features. And one major thing there is a centralized logging service that you can enable that collects all the Ceph cluster logs from the daemons into one place, so you can kind of see everything and analyze it more easily. Upcoming in SQUID, there's more coverage of more advanced RGW multi-site workflows, the upcoming NVMe gateway, as well as better management for CephFS and cluster upgrades as well. These are all kind of integrated with the CEPHADM orchestration framework, so everything works well together. In RGW, generally the focus there has been on optimizing the object storage for more complex and more data-intensive workloads, especially in the AI space, in the analytics space. So there's a lot of work to be able to run some of the computation directly on the storage nodes via things like S3 select, which essentially lets you run queries against your object storage data and get the results in a way that can, in the future, be kind of reused between different queries using these kind of Apache Arrow and Parquet formats that let you kind of have a multi-stage pipeline that doesn't have to keep reading and writing data back and forth all the time. It just kind of stays in the storage system. You can kind of think of it like a materialized view in SQL, if you're familiar with that. In CEPHADM, it's quite feature complete now in terms of what it does to manage a Ceph cluster. We're trying to make things a bit simpler. In REEF, there's automatic key rotation for daemons, so the subx keys that they use can be easily changed. Some improvements for the RGW multi-site workflows, and in SQUID there's going to be more newer services like the NVMe gateway and potentially other things like maybe a CephFS mirroring service that may be in SQUID, maybe in a future release, be managed by this as well. Work is the orchestration framework that is used for deploying Ceph with Kubernetes, and it's going to have support for REEF shortly after the REEF release, which is probably going to be in July or so as well. And it also supports the new automatic key rotation for OSDs. In RBD, a lot of work has gone on to the disaster recovery areas for RBD mirroring in particular. There's also ongoing efforts to stabilize and make the NVMe gateway more hardened and ready to use. We expect this to be certainly ready for in SQUID. In REEF, it's more of like a MVP. It's still getting more hardening and testing done. And there's also some interesting research going on at Northeastern University into a kind of log-structured format for RBD, where instead of having one block in RBD represented by one object in Ceph, every time you do a write, it's going to be appended to an object in Ceph. This could enable a lot more efficient CPU usage for smaller write workloads, so vastly better performance, and much more efficient snapshots and clones as well. But that's a very early stage of research right now, so we'll see where that goes. In CephFS, some of the major areas are around encryption and disaster recovery as well. There's now snapshot diff support in REEF, which means that you can get the difference between two snapshots in terms of which files changed. I think there's some more improvements and infrastructure needed around there to make that more of an automated solution right now, but that's kind of the building blocks are getting there for disaster recovery. And we're also making lots of improvements to our general developer experience and testing infrastructure. As I mentioned, the REEF release this year was delayed a bit because of a major outage in our lab, so we're re-architecting that a bit and making that more reliable, and also improving the developer experience of how to test Ceph. So there's now a way to actually run the full suite of Ceph integration tests locally using containers. This doesn't test the kernel clients because you can't install a custom kernel with a container. You're just using whatever the host already has. But it can cover everything else much more easily than waiting for packages to be built and kicking off a build in a long queue. So the next step there is to make that even container build process itself much faster, so you can just use your local compiled version very easily. And there's work on adding more performance testing to the CI system so that we can catch any regressions, or whether it's throughput, latency, memory, or CPU usage as soon as they happen, instead of only detecting them whenever somebody gets around to testing those things. Finally, there's been tons of more work going on documentation thanks to Zach Dover, Cole Mitchell, and Anthony Datry. So they've been going through all the Ceph documentation and different pieces and chunks and updating it and making it much clearer to new users. So there's been tons and tons of changes this past year, and the focus next year as well is on making a much more kind of beginner's guide to Ceph. So it's starting off with no knowledge at all. How do we go from learning the basics of Ceph to having a real Ceph cluster in the easiest way possible? And if you have any documentation suggestions, feel free to contact Zach Dover. He's very happy to hear your thoughts. He maintains an Etherpad where anybody can add anything that needs to be updated or changed, and he'll get around to addressing it as soon as he can. Oh, and wanted to mention that tomorrow we have a Ceph Day. We've been kind of kickstarting the Ceph community again this year. We had Ceph Days in India, the U.S., tomorrow in Vancouver here, as well as there was one yesterday in Seoul, South Korea. And we just had our first CephLookCon in 4 years in Amsterdam in April, which was fantastic. It was really great to get everybody together again and really feel the vibrancy of the community. So please join us here. It's open to anybody at the Open Infra conference. It's going to be starting at 10:20 tomorrow morning. And there'll be a Ceph Birds of a Feather session at the end as well, where folks can share their experiences running Ceph and trade tips and improvement ideas. So that's kind of a whirlwind tour of what's going on with Ceph. And we're happy to answer questions.
So I saw in an earlier slide there was a number of administrative work
Actually, I'm going to repeat the question for the recording. The question is if the management tasks in the short-term plans include key shredding or sanitization for GDPR compliance. No. The focus of the management at this point is largely on making the dashboard such that you can take a Ceph cluster and manage it without touching the CLI. And ideally, you're a junior administrator, which means not that you have never heard of Ceph. It means you went through 1 week of training in one of the existing courses. You know kind of how Ceph works, and then you can be entrusted with a cluster and using the UI to kind of provide you with guardrails where you don't do anything dangerous. And I think we're close to the point where you can realistically manage RADOS using the UI only. Very complicated outages, or you built a harebrained configuration or a very specific configuration, and that requires special handling and care, you'll still need to go to the CLI. There is also another factor, which is the vast majority of current Ceph administrators like the CLI, right? So we're trying to charm them into using the UI more, because obviously they're not junior administrators. And so there is some functionality that's going into the UI that is advanced functionality, like items that are around RGW multi-site monitoring, for example, or looking at counters of events for RGW. So we're trying to add value for the senior, for the high-level operator as well. But that's a lower priority, because the mission of the dashboard is really to increase Ceph's usability. But for day one, it's been covered for years. For monitoring, it's been covered for years. For day two, I think we'll be there next year.
Earlier you mentioned worm certification.
Yes.
Do the users of Ceph have to recertify again against their own hardware, or does that certification cover the SEC compliance?
So the certification is product specific, right? So there is community Ceph, and then we have a number of vendors like Red Hat, IBM, Canonical, etc., making their own products. The certification is product specific.
Okay.
So you have to be a customer of an entity that has certified. For what we plan for the IBM and Red Hat Ceph versions is worm certification for SEC Rule 17 compliance, which is a financial certification in the US, and the corresponding rule in Europe under, I believe the regulator there is FINRA.
Okay.
That's the target. There are other types of worm certification that are possible. If you have other scenarios that are interesting, I'd like to hear that.
No, it is that scenario. I guess my question is, once that is certified according to that one, it's immaterial what hardware it sits on, because the certification is already there.
Right. It should be immaterial. We're not pairing it with IBM hardware or Dell hardware or a specific hardware stack.
Okay, thank you.
It's software-defined storage certification. Actually, if you want one more point on that, I think the reason why you're thinking about this is that worm should prevent people from deleting things, or and obviously in a software-only product, there is the question of how will you restrict root or the equivalent of root from doing those kind of actions. So the way that this is usually done for software-defined products, and Ceph is not the first software-defined storage product to get certified for this, is that the certifying entity basically documents what workflows are supported in which way, and how you're putting this restriction in place, and how it potentially could be bypassed so that those avenues are blocked by the customer, so that they don't have to worry about those scenarios. All righty. Thank you so much.